started.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, all. Welcome to the COVID-19 financial response call. This is our technical assistance seminar sessions that we do weekly. We are excited to present them. We are happy to have you. Please feel free to ask as many questions as possible. You can use the chat feature where you raise your hand above on Teams. And if you're not into that sort of method, you can, of course, just ping us and just speak out loud and ask your question verbally. We'll save some time at the end, and don't be shy. Do us a favor. Please ask as many as you can. If any of my Collier County CFOs are on, welcome. We would welcome your questions as well. And the whole point of this is really to get the word out. We know that these American Rescue Plan, the guidance is routinely changing and it's ever evolving. And so, the more we know, the better we can act and do this stuff properly. So again, thank you for joining. Guidehouse and team, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'm Natalie Hewitt. I've been working with Guidehouse in Cook County over the last year. We started last year working on the CARES Act, and so we're taking a lot of the notes and lessons we learned there, and we've revitalized our webinar series. And today we're going to cover just some ARPA overview, working specifically at the Fiscal Recovery Fund that all of you have received either through the state or directly from Treasury. And we'll talk through the webinar schedule. Right now it's scheduled just to go through. We'll talk a little bit more what's scheduled to go through this week, and then we'll be releasing some new webinar dates based on some reporting requirements and guidelines that came out late yesterday. And we'll also talk through a little bit of the allocations, comparison to last year's CARES Act, which I know a number of you received. And then the bulk of this will focus on eligible uses of the money. So with any federal grant, there are some things you can use it for and some things you are not supposed to use it for. So we want to talk through that. And that's going to be really where, if you have any questions on if something is an eligible expense, that's really where we can hit on that. And then last, we will look at some of the reporting requirements. A few people have a deadline at the end of this month for a report, and we'll talk through that. We'll also have a webinar covering those reporting requirements tomorrow. So really, what is ARPA? The American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law earlier this year by President Biden, and a portion of it did allocate money directly to local units of government, either through the state or directly from Treasury. And part of that is that kind of that top yellow box of the local fiscal relief funds. And that's really what we're going to be looking at today. But if you notice, there's a lot of buckets of money that qualifies under ARPA. So want to be very careful when we say ARPA, we mean all of the buckets. But when we say FRF or fiscal recovery funds, that's that little yellow box in the top left. The other cards that we have on the left-hand side of the screen really show kind of other eligible uses where other money is going to be coming from the government out into the communities and for a variety of different things. But today we're focusing really on that fiscal recovery fund and what we can and can't do. So one item that we learned last year was we had a webinar series over the summer when we were talking through the CARES Act application process, and we had these webinars we had held every week. So we've revamped those, we're bringing them back. And so we have webinar series Tuesdays through Thursdays at 10 a.m. We do have open office hours on Fridays at 10 a.m. And what that means is between 10 and 11 a.m. you can ask us any questions about fiscal recovery funds, ARPA in general, any of the items that we cover on any of our webinars. We also have a bi-weekly newsletter that goes out. And as Michael said, if you have any questions, you can just ping us, you can email us, and we'll respond to your questions. And we are tweaking these webinars as we go based on the questions we're receiving. So please, please, please ask your questions. If we don't know the answer today, we will definitely follow up with you and then post it in our FAQs on the website. Just to give a bit of a schedule, we are in that last week of our currently scheduled webinars, but Treasury did release reporting requirements yesterday on all of the reports that will be due. So we're going to start scheduling and looking through what reporting webinars we might want to have. I think we might focus on one on that interim report, which we have tomorrow. We might revamp that and kind of build out some of the information there now that we have more guidelines. As we know, it kind of shifts all the way until the end of the spending period. But we'll also just kind of have reporting in general, because all of us will have to be reporting to the government how we're spending the money. So with that, how did the Treasury Department decide who gets what? There are two kind of big portions that we look at. One is the metropolitan cities, and that's going to be populations of over 50,000 people. And so the county qualifies as a metro city. A number of the municipalities qualify as a metro city, but not everyone. The city of Chicago also qualifies. It's based on the HUD CDBG formula. And then we have what we're calling the non-entitlement units of government, or NEUs. And that's going to be our smaller governments that are, they're going to be the ones receiving the money through the state. So metro cities are receiving their money directly from Treasury. So you should have gotten registered for it, applied for it, got it directly from the Treasury. And then the NEUs have to apply through the state to get the money. So $742 million was given to the state of Illinois. You also need to apply to get that from the state of Illinois, and the state has provided a list of all of the NEUs and the allocation amounts on their websites. We didn't include that here, but they have it listed on their website. And so this next slide, just kind of breaks down who's receiving money and qualifies as a metro city, and who's going to be kind of qualified as an NEU. Again, it's that 50,000 in population. If you're over 50,000, you're a metro city, and you fall on the left side of the screen, and then the NEUs fall on the right side of the screen. So it's about $221 million coming from the state to our NEUs. And what are we going to do with the money? So the money is going to be issued in two tranches, both for metro cities and for the NEUs. And the first will come in 2021. So presumably a lot of the metro cities have received that money already. The next 50% will come in 2022. The important period of performance dates, all of our expenses have to be including or after March 3rd, 2021. Funds must be obligated, so they have to be either committed to a program, somehow put on a PO, a contract, an agreement by the end of 2024. But we don't have to spend the money until 2026. So you have to know what you're doing with all of your money by the end of 2024, but you don't necessarily have to have it spent until the end of 2026. That's a little bit different than what we had last year with the CARES Act. The CARES Act window was significantly shorter when we only had about originally 9 months, and then we got extended through the end of this year. I skipped ahead, Monica, and then to the next slide. We can come back to that. How to get money from the state in just a minute. But really looking at the CARES Act, it was a much shorter window. We didn't have a lot of time. That was really the Treasury and the government's commitment to responding to COVID-19. That was 2020. And so we had limited expenditures, really just trying to respond. And now with this ARPA funding, with the Fiscal Recovery Act, we have that longer window in an effort to build more resiliency and to recover from COVID-19. So the Treasury Department understands that the pandemic has hit communities in a variety of different ways and at different time points along the way. So not only, we had last year into this year for our CARES Act funding, really responding to the pandemic itself. Now the government's saying, we know you've responded to it. Now let's build back a little bit stronger. And so we're allowing for more strategy planning for the use of the money. So it went from 9 months and then another year to 5 years total to spend the money. If we go back to the previous slide, it just kind of outlines how the NEUs can apply for the money from the state. So you'll need to go to their website and click through, enter your details, collect the information, enter them into the portal by September 30th. So that's an important date for our NEUs. Certify, and then they'll receive the money within 30 days after they've completed that. So really just, we jumped a little bit. Well, we'll rearrange the order of the slides going forward. But now that we have the money in hand, theoretically, we have until the end of 2026 to spend it. What can we spend it on? So there's 6 major buckets for the overview for the eligible uses. The first being that supporting public health response. This is acknowledging that the pandemic is still going on. I know the Delta variant, I heard yesterday there's a Delta Plus variant. Apparently there's a Lambda variant coming out now too. So there is still a pandemic response component of how this money can be used. There's also, addressing those negative economic impacts. Like I said, the communities were hit in a variety of different ways. All of our industries were hit kind of collectively at the same time, really took a toll on the community itself and kind of building. So this eligible use is building those back, whether it's a small business grant. And we'll discuss each of these in a little bit further detail in just a minute. The next category is this premium pay. It's very similar to hazard pay in the CARES Act funding, but it's going to be a little more specific and really relates to those workers who were not able to telework during the pandemic. So it's going to be your frontline workers, your staff, your janitors, anybody who's in a nursing home and weren't able to effectively or even possibly do their job working remotely. On the bottom level, we have replacing our public sector revenue loss. We have a webinar on Thursdays that will walk through in greater detail the revenue loss calculation and what that can be used for. So once we calculate our number, we can use it for what's called general government services. We'll talk through a little bit of what that means. Like I said, we have all these yeses that we can use it for. We'll get to the no's in just a minute. And so with that revenue loss, we can only say yes to spending it on government services. And then the last two are really an acknowledgement to the infrastructure and how communities had to kind of got pushed to the limits with their current infrastructure, and where some of those might have been a little bit weaker. And now we have the ability and the money and the resources to build back those infrastructure components a little bit stronger. Those are all of our yeses. At least this year, we conveniently had 6 yeses to our 6 nos, meaning we have 6 kind of big buckets that we can't use the fiscal recovery funds for. So we aren't allowed to put it towards any sort of rainy day funds or financial reserves. As with most federal government money coming to communities, you're not allowed to use any sort of debt, pay down any debt or legal settlements. That's pretty common for our federal money grants. Pension funds are also specifically called out. I know there's a number of questions on the revenue side when we get to calculating revenue loss on pension funds, but we cannot just put our fiscal recovery funds into our pension funds. And then last, general infrastructure, we'll get into a little bit more of that and how general infrastructure can qualify as a general service under the revenue loss calculation, or a government service rather, under the revenue loss calculation. But we can't just kind of for general infrastructure, spend our money on that. So it had to be under those broadband or the water and sewer infrastructure eligible uses. And we'll talk through specifics of what those 2 categories are. And then lastly, a non-federal match for federal programs. This is when if you have a federal government or a federal award, federal grant, and it says, we'll pay 75%, you have to cost share for 25%. This fiscal recovery funds can't be used for that federal matching portion of a different federal grant. So the no's and then the yeses, and then kind of circling back, we'll go through a little bit more detail, the different eligible uses. So again, this is still a pandemic. We are still kind of seeing the effects of COVID-19 on our daily lives. And so really one of the eligible categories, as it was last year with CARES Act, was supporting that public health response. This could be anything from mitigation, including vaccinations. About 2 weeks ago, President Biden put out a call to encourage governments to use the money for the $100 vaccination incentives for newly vaccinated individuals. I know there's a lot of talk about how to get the vaccination rates up in many of communities just around the country. Another item that is specifically called out as a response of how how the pandemic impacted the country last year is behavioral and mental health. And so really saying, yes, you can use this for some mental health care of your community, how you can help people that are dealing with not only the pandemic, but just other crises in their lives, really just kind of looking at it from a holistic view. And then last, we have our public health and safety staff. This is a little bit different than the CARES Act last year, where we could use 100%. We just administratively, the Treasury said all public health and safety qualify. This year, they've cut it to all public health and safety that are primarily or more than 50% dedicated to responding to COVID-19. And I know we had some questions on how do you prove that, and whether it's documenting on timesheets or kind of taking a survey and just giving, some sort of providing that documentation. So it's not necessarily a blanket administrative clearance like we had last summer. So a little bit more nuanced, but still some broad uses for our public health response. And then moving into the negative economic impacts, this is again, how our communities were hit, how our small businesses were hit, how our restaurants were hit. So really, this negative impacts, economic impacts, eligible use is going to allow us to give loans or grants or some sort of help to our small businesses in the community itself. And if you had a furlough and you had to lay off a number of your staff, the amount that it costs to bring somebody back on is also covered as an eligible expense. Monica, if you could switch to, thank you. And then, talking through some economic relief programs, whether this is a lot of the statistics and performance metrics that we'll have to report on our money if you need some data analysis done to see how your communities were impacted. That's going to be an eligible expense to really be able to address and target those industries and those businesses that were impacted most. I feel like we kind of know, we all know individually where we were hit the hardest, so that may not be as necessary. But if there's any kind of improvements or data analysis to drive that decision, those expenses would be eligible under this category. And one thing to note, we're talking through each of these categories, and it's not just kind of a, here's all the things that are eligible. When we do the reporting, we can talk to this a little bit later, we have to identify which of the categories all of our expenses will fall under. So it's really important to be able to say, this is, we're giving a grant to our small businesses, it's going to be under our addressing negative economic impacts. And there's a laundry list, there's about 66 categories within this. So we're talking 6, and then there's 66 subcategories underneath that we'll have to tag all of our expenses towards when we do our reporting. So we're not just kind of talking through individual examples, not only for your benefit to kind of understand all of the uses that we can have, but also how we can code them when we need to do our reporting. One piece of information to know is that while we have some really broad swaths of eligible expenses for our qualified census tracts, these are going to be additional services are going to be made eligible. So not only saying, yes, the pandemic hit everybody, but yes, the pandemic hit everybody and some disproportionately impacted communities. And so here for those QCTs or qualified census tracts, we're able to spend the money in even more accessible ways. So even broader categories on that, so whether it's housing vouchers, or looking a little bit deeper at education and how things might be improved there. These QCTs will really be able to kind of spend their money in a variety of different ways. And so we're still looking for guidance from Treasury. They might have put it out a little bit yesterday on how we really kind of detail and identify these QCTs and how the spending there, in case that, these are all qualified and eligible expenses, but there's really a little bit broader for the QCTs going forward. Excuse me. So moving back to our eligible expenses, we'll talk through a little bit of the premium pay. And what this is going to be is for, I guess I mentioned before, those unable to telework essential workers. So a lot of us, we're on a remote call right now. A lot of people haven't been able to get back into the office, but some people didn't have the ability to do teleworking. And so there's a little bit more criteria around what those premium pay employees can be. It can be up to $13 per hour, but it cannot exceed $25,000 per person. And so really it's saying thank you to those who weren't able to telework, those who faced COVID in a little more prominent facing positions such as nursing, healthcare, public health and safety, janitors and sanitation workers. But any time that was performed remotely would not be considered an eligible time for the premium pay. So if you want to kind of look at someone's timesheet and see if they worked remote and kind of not do a blanket approval, then we're really going to have to get, documentation is going to be key for that to really understand who's eligible and for what hours. But that's going to be at a municipality, kind of at the municipality level discretion of how they're defining what an essential worker would be. But there are some examples there on the left-hand side of what we can qualify as an eligible essential worker. Our next eligible expense, if you remember, we're kind of clocking our way through, we're hitting that bottom row. We're going to talk through a little bit of the revenue loss. So you'll see on the left-hand side a fairly broad equation. We'll talk through on Thursday in our revenue loss webinar in much greater detail of what all of those numbers are. But really what it's saying is find what your 2020 revenue could have been, subtract what your 2020 revenue actually was, and that's going to be your revenue loss number. And then, as we mentioned before, that's going to be used for eligible government services. So that's where our general infrastructure categories really come in, including environmental remediation, buildings, or improvements to buildings that doesn't qualify for those broadband or water and sewer infrastructure eligible expenses. So we've got to calculate our revenue loss, and then we can use the money towards those government services. Again, we can't use this to go into any sort of debts, towards any sort of debts or interest or borrowed money, nor can it be for settlement agreements. So those ineligible uses still qualify. I know those are government services, but they're not to be used for with the revenue loss calculation. So Not going to spend a lot of time kind of walking through the numbers. We'll do that for a full hour on Thursdays. It's quite fun to go through math as a group, talking through some examples. So our last two eligible expense categories are the water and sewer infrastructure and then broadband. And really looking at water and sewer, the EPA has a clean water and a safe drinking water fund. And there's a number of projects listed under each of those funds. And so the Treasury kind of said, if they qualify for those two funds, they're going to qualify as our water and sewer infrastructure expenses. And so you can see it's got anything from stormwater, cybersecurity, and climate change, kind of walking through, removing lead pipes. So really just wanted to build in the infrastructure of our communities to be able to provide fresh, clean water to all of our residents. And so anything that qualifies kind of under these two EPA program funds would also qualify as an eligible expense on our water, underneath our water and sewer infrastructure category. And lastly, we have our broadband infrastructure. This is really kind of a response to how everyone, potentially almost everyone, got pushed into a remote working environment, and not everyone had access to the same level of Wi-Fi or internet capabilities. And so the strain that was on the infrastructure there, there's a lot of qualifications around kind of how much and how fast the internet needs to be in order for it to be an eligible expense here. But really, some of the examples are prioritizing fiber optics, building out that infrastructure, making sure that it could even be pre-project costs. So understanding infrastructure costs, or infrastructure projects rather, take a long time. Getting the wires, laying out the map, digging the holes, that takes a lot of time. And so it could just be kind of those pre-planning costs and not necessarily the implementation of actually putting the wires down. So if you're midway through a project like this, we could use some of those planning qualification costs up until or no earlier than March 3rd, 2021. So really some good uses to get everyone up to a little bit higher speed as we go. There's two other categories that count as an eligible expense. You'll notice administrative costs. It's always a fun one. This is going to be the costs that are, if you hire consultants to help manage and oversee your money, if you hire anybody for compliance, if you do anything, any monitoring, kind of performance metrics. On that side, those are going to be your administrative costs. Anything that's kind of administrative costs for one of the projects, would fall under that project expenditure code. And we'll talk through that a little bit more tomorrow and how that really ties back to those Treasury expenditure categories and reporting. So we got, like I said, we'll talk through reporting in just a minute. But the other category we have are subaward funds. So if you, the municipality or community, want to give money to another unit of government, you can create a subaward. It also includes nonprofits. Generally you have an agreement, you sign, kind of set up your contracts with them, and really lay out the programs and the projects. And the county will have a number of nonprofits that we'll have agreements with, and those will be considered, some of them will be considered subawards. But those, there's a whole level of internal monitoring that goes on with those and internal controls. I'm sure many of you remember we asked a lot of questions last summer about those applications with the CARES money. And so it's going to be a very similar experience with the ARPA funds if you give those to other, to other nonprofits or to other units of government. And that really ties out all of the eligible expenses. And I know it was a lot of information, a lot of examples. There are some FAQs listed on the Treasury website. We have a resources slide later in the deck. But again, the reason we went through kind of each level of eligible expenses is not only to give examples of what qualifies, but also kind of talking through the reporting. So everyone that's considered a metro city will have a report due at the end of this month. It's the interim report. It's going to be all of your project expenditures and obligations from March 3rd through July 31st, 2021. The good news is that if you didn't spend anything before the end of July, those will all be zeros, but you'll be able to see the Treasury categories and how it's broken down into these subcategories. And we'll talk through the interim report and the project and expenditure report in greater detail tomorrow. I'm skipping over that middle section because that's only applicable to the county. But that project and expenditure report will qualify, everyone qualifies to fill that out. Any use will have to submit that annually. and metro cities will be sending that in quarterly to Treasury. And so what that's going to say, and the difference between the interim report and the project and expenditure report, is that the interim report is kind of cumulative across just the Treasury categories, and the project and expenditure report is going to report on a project level basis. So really, if you've set up something, the program, you're going to set up a small business grant, you'll be reporting how much you've obligated towards that program and then how much you've actually spent. And so each quarter for the metro cities and annually for the non-entitlement units, you'll be reporting how much has been spent against that. And it's really the government's way of saying, how are we doing? What are we spending it on? Where's the money going out? That middle column is really only applicable to the city of Chicago and Cook County for our kind of relative scale. And that's going to be an annual report. It's called the Recovery Plan or the Recovery Plan Performance Report. And it's really talking through how the money is being allocated, what's the thought process and the framework behind the allocations, what are the key performance metrics that you're going to be working on and posting. And, this report has to be published on the county's website. And so that's due to Treasury at the end of this month as well. And there's new reporting guidelines that came out yesterday. So we will be updating tomorrow's interim report webinar with any additional information that we've learned in the last 24 hours to really give a better idea of how the Treasury is really looking to have that information come through. And then on the next two slides, we really just kind of line out a schedule of everyone's reporting. So we talked through the NEUs, but kind of watching it, looking at it kind of come out into a timeline schedule. The numbers on the timeline themselves are when the project and expenditure reports will be due. So that's an annual submission at the end of 2024. Remember, we have to incur or obligate all of our funds. And then if it's been incurred by 2024 or obligated by 2024, rather, we have to have it spent by the end of 2026. So you can see it's just a longer stretch for everyone to spend and obligate their money as compared to last summer with our CARES Act funding. And then the next slide really shows the same schedule, but for our metro cities. And so there's a lot more little bubbles for our quarterly reports with that project and expenditure report. And we did not add the performance plan because they only qualify for the city and the county themselves. But you'll see it's just every quarter at the end of the quarter, you have 30 days following the end of the calendar quarter to submit your project and expenditure report and get those in. And the portal, it's going to be through a portal. Again, we'll talk through it a little bit more detail tomorrow. We just got the reporting guidelines and some screenshots of how that's going to be entered, and so the Treasury can see it. And that portal is going to be used for the metro cities, for the project and expenditure, and for the county for the performance plan recovery plan performance report. One thing that we're including in our newsletter is, if you remember way back at the beginning of this presentation, there's this many buckets or the cards that qualify as an American Rescue Plan Act program. Not all of them are coming directly to the county. Not all of them come directly to you. You have to apply for them. And so in the newsletter that we'll be sending out and in all of our webinars, we'll really list out any additional funds or grants that people might be able to apply for. Some of them, the state will get the money and then send it out into the smaller communities. But there's one due, the Emergency Connectivity Fund. The application is due at the end of this week. And then the Broadband Infrastructure Grant is due early next week. So we wanted to start including these so that everyone is aware of upcoming deadlines for our grants and are applying for them so that you can have additional funding. The fiscal recovery funds are not the only pieces of money coming out into the community. And so really wanted to give kind of a broad view as things are coming up. Please apply to them if you're able. You can bring more money into the community to help everyone out. So what now? What do we do kind of going forward? I know the money's been either on our minds for a while or maybe in our bank accounts. Kind of how do we want to think through? If you haven't applied for it from the state of Illinois, please remember that deadline is September 30th at 5 p.m. The previous slide had the steps that you need to complete in order to complete that application, including the data points that the state will need in order to get you the funding. And then really kind of thinking internally, who needs to sit at the table to make these decisions? How do we determine what the community wants? How do we determine the actual needs of the community? based on the eligible expenses, does one jump out at us more than another in order to really support the community throughout the next 5 years? And so I've heard it called anything from an intergenerational kind of strategy planning. We just have such a long runway in order to think through some of these larger projects that it's just going to be a really beneficial kind of generationally transforming initiative. So once you kind of take your big ideas, run them back through that eligibility screening again. Is it actually eligible? How does it qualify? How does it respond to the pandemic? Which of the categories does it come into? Do we have any subawards? Do we need to set those things up? So there's a lot of internal kind of insight. And then once we've figured out which projects we want to fund with our money, then we'll start the reporting sequence, or we'll start reporting it to the government rather. And if you haven't, obligated anything, those would be zeros until you do. And so just really kind of making sure that we've got everything lined up so that we know how to implement one of these programs successfully. The next two slides, we'll get to the end of my spiel here in a minute, and we do have a number of resources listed. These are links to the Treasury site, to the state of Illinois, to the Cook County site, specifically on ARPA, and we did include the policy roadmap, and that's how the county is driving a number of its decisions on how to spend the money is off of that policy roadmap, if you'd like to use that for reference as well. And then on the last slide, we have a QR code that will link to a forms document that you're able to use to send us questions directly. You're also welcome to send us any questions to suburban COVID funding questions at cookcountyil.gov. It should look familiar to those that participated in last year's CARES application process. But if not, you can also, I will pause here for questions. We can talk through anything that we've covered today or any other questions about the ARPA or fiscal recovery funds in general. So I don't know, Monica, is there anything in the chat already for questions?
I'm not seeing any yet.
Great. I know it was a lot of information. I hope some of it was familiar based on some, just any sort of research and kind of understanding. But if there are any questions on maybe the period of performance, kind of what obligated versus incurred means, any of the reporting we can talk through, please feel free to raise your hand. Just start asking your question, add it to the chat. Quiet group today. I guess one question, this is kind of going back to our webinar schedule. This is the last scheduled instance of this ARPA overview, and just wanted to get a sense from others or from those that are here if this is something you'd like to have again in this format, or maybe we just kind of cover the eligible categories at large very quickly before the start of our other webinars, and that will be plenty, and you don't need all of the kind of the intricate details. Like I mentioned, we'll be focusing a little bit more on reporting after this week's scheduled series, just because those dates will be coming fast, and we want to be able to support everyone as they commit and submit their reports over the next 2 months. All right. Give it just a minute or two more for any questions, or otherwise we will wrap up today, not to keep anyone on the phone longer than needed, but please let us know if you have any additional questions. Like I said, you can email us either directly or you can fill out the form we'll be checking all of our inboxes to make sure that everyone's covered. The slides will be posted on the county website, as will the recording of this webinar and our other webinars. I think we're going to choose the best of the best in terms of the recordings and put those on the county website, so you're able to access those at any time. Also, to plug the website, we do have a set of FAQs. So the Treasury has established their own FAQs for a very broad number of questions. It's a good resource, but also we'll have our own set of FAQs based on the questions that were asked in the webinars and of us directly through our email addresses. So we'll have that kind of more tailored to the Cook County questions as well. I'll give it one or two more minutes for questions. If not, I really appreciate everyone's time this morning. I know hopefully this is becoming old hat for you. You're understanding the eligible expenses, or at least getting an idea of where we can spend our money without fear of it being considered an ineligible expense. Well, without any questions, not hearing or seeing anything from the group, I appreciate everyone's time this morning. Again, we'll be back tomorrow to talk through the reporting requirements. The Treasury did just upload some new guidelines yesterday, so we'll be reading those. It's about 53 delightfully easy read pages, and including screenshots of the portal. So we'll be in the thick of it, pouring some more coffee and having a bit of a light read on reporting requirements for both the inner reporting and the project and expenditure reports. So we'll cover any additional new items in tomorrow's webinar, same time, 10 a.m. The links are also on that county website. So thank you everyone for your time this morning. We appreciate it. And again, if you have any questions, just please let us know.